There is a moment somewhere around 2 in the morning when the body of a grieving person does something that has nothing to do with sadness. The stomach contracts, the esophagus tightens. A wave of nausea rises without warning, sharp and sourceless, the way grief itself arrives. Not when you expect it, but in the dark, when everything else has gone quiet. You have not eaten anything. You have not done anything. You are simply lying there, trying to sleep, and your body is refusing in a language you were never taught to read. Richard Feynman would have wanted to understand that language, not because he was interested in suffering, but because Feynman was constitutionally incapable of accepting a system he did not understand. And the body of a person in grief is, among all things, a system behaving in ways that defy the surface explanation. He would have started with a question, not the consoling kind, the precise kind. What exactly is happening in that stomach? And the answer, the full answer, not the comfortable one, is far stranger and far more significant than most people are ever told. Your stomach, the night after a loss, is not resting. It is not digesting. It is not doing what a stomach is biologically designed to do between midnight and 6 in the morning. It is doing something else entirely. And that something else is what this video is about. The enteric nervous system is one of the most poorly publicized structures in human biology. Most people, when they think of the nervous system, think of the brain, the spinal cord, the electrochemical relay racing down nerve fibers in milliseconds, telling fingers to move, lungs to breathe, eyes to close, but running the entire length of the gastrointestinal tract, from the esophagus through the stomach, the small intestine, the colon, is a second nervous system, embedded in the walls of the gut itself, containing approximately 500 million neurons. To put that number in a frame Feynman would have appreciated, the spinal cord, that magnificent conduit between brain and body that we have spent centuries studying, contains roughly 100 million neurons. The gut has 5 times that many. Feynman would not have let that go unremarked. He would have leaned forward, picked up a piece of chalk and said, "Why? Why does digestion need that many neurons? What is the gut deciding that requires 500 million decision points?" The answer is that the enteric nervous system does not simply process food. It monitors. It evaluates. It responds to chemical signals from the blood, from the immune system, from the microbiome, and, critically, from the vagus nerve, the great wandering conduit that connects the brainstem to nearly every organ in the thorax and abdomen. The vagus nerve is the anatomical fact that makes grief a gut phenomenon, because the vagus nerve runs both ways. When the brain processes a catastrophic loss, and the brain does process loss as a physical event, as a measurable disruption in predictive circuitry, it sends signals down the vagus nerve into the gut. Those signals alter gut motility. They change the secretion of digestive enzymes. They shift blood flow. They modulate the movement of the stomach wall. But here is what is less commonly known, and what Feynman would have fixed on immediately. The information does not only travel downward. Approximately 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent. They carry signals from the body upward into the brain, not the other way around. Your gut is not simply receiving instructions from your grieving brain. Your gut is sending reports back. What those reports say, and what the brain does with them at 2 in the morning, is the mechanism underneath everything most people describe as the physical sensation of loss. If you have ever felt what grief does to the body at night, that hollow pressure, that nauseated wakefulness, there is a book that goes further into the science of it than anything else I have found. It is called What Feynman Knew About Grief, and it is available through the link in the pinned comment below. Only while this video is up. Before you continue watching, I want to ask you one question. In the weeks after your loss, did your body feel wrong in ways you could not name? Not just sad, but physically wrong? Hold that answer. We are going to come back to it. The circadian system is among the most elegant regulatory architectures in biology. It is not, as it is often described, simply a sleep-wake cycle. The circadian system is a 24-hour oscillation of nearly every biochemical process in the human body. Hormone secretion, core body temperature, immune activation, cellular repair, and directly relevant here, the motility and secretory activity of the gastrointestinal tract. The healthy gut follows a clock. Gastric acid secretion peaks in the early evening, calibrated to the expectation of a final meal. By 10 or 11 at night, it begins to fall. The migrating motor complex, a wave of electrical activity that sweeps through the small intestine every 90 minutes during fasting, becomes the dominant motility pattern, clearing debris, moving residue toward the colon, preparing the system for the demands of morning. The stomach, in a biologically undisturbed body, spends the night in a kind of low-grade housekeeping mode. Not inactive, never inactive, but regulated, rhythmic, orderly. Grief destroys that order. Not metaphorically, measurably, biochemically, at the level of hormones and nerve firing rates. The primary instrument of destruction is cortisol. Cortisol is the adrenal hormone most associated with the stress response, and it is, under normal circumstances, precisely calibrated to the circadian rhythm. In a non-grieving person, cortisol reaches its nadir, its lowest point, around midnight, and begins its slow ascent toward the pre-dawn peak that prepares the body for waking. In the acutely bereaved, that nadir disappears. Studies measuring cortisol in the weeks following significant loss show a flattening of the normal diurnal curve. The rhythmic drop that should occur between midnight and 4 in the morning does not happen. Cortisol stays elevated. In some individuals, it rises further in the middle of the night, producing what researchers describe as nocturnal cortisol surges, spikes of stress hormone, at precisely the hours when the biology is most vulnerable, least defended. Feynman had a particular contempt for descriptions that substituted emotional language for physical explanation. He would have appreciated this one instead. A nocturnal cortisol surge in a grieving person is not sadness. It is a measurable event. It happens in the blood. It happens in the adrenal gland. It happens in the gut wall. And when it happens, the stomach cannot rest. Cortisol directly stimulates gastric acid secretion. It alters the mucus layer protecting the stomach lining. It affects gut permeability in ways that allow bacterial products to cross from the gut lumen into the bloodstream, triggering low-grade systemic inflammation. It influences the rate at which the stomach empties its contents into the small intestine, slowing, in most cases, the gastric emptying rate so that food sits longer, pressure builds, and reflux becomes more likely. This is why grieving people wake at 2 in the morning with that burning, sourceless nausea. It is not psychological weakness. It is not metaphor. It is cortisol hitting the stomach wall at 3 in the morning because the grief-disrupted adrenal axis has lost its rhythm. The physics of what grief does to the gut at night goes deeper than most people have been told. What Feynman knew about grief breaks it down in the way Feynman himself would have. Not to comfort, but to make the system legible. The link is in the pinned comment, only available while this video is running. Within 48 to 72 hours of a significant loss, the microbiome, the approximately 38 trillion microbial organisms living in the gastrointestinal tract, begins to shift. Longitudinal studies of bereaved individuals using microbial sequencing have documented meaningful changes in key bacterial populations. Lactobacillus species, associated with serotonin precursor production, decline. Proteobacteria, associated with inflammatory signaling, increase. The consequence is relevant to sleep in a way that is almost never discussed. Approximately 95% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut, not the brain, the gut. In the gut, serotonin coordinates motility and serves as the primary precursor to melatonin. The synthesis pathway is linear and unforgiving. Tryptophan converted by gut bacteria into serotonin, then transported to the pineal gland, where it is converted at night into the hormone that governs the descent into sleep. When the grief-disrupted microbiome reduces the population of serotonin-producing bacteria, that pathway narrows. Less serotonin, less melatonin, precursor. Less capacity for the pineal gland to produce the signal that tells the nervous system it is time to rest. The stomach is, in the most literal sense, part of the reason a grieving person cannot sleep. It is not producing enough of the molecular raw material that sleep requires, and it is producing that deficit at night, in the dark, at the hours when the biological cost is highest. Feynman, presented with this cascade, would have drawn it on a blackboard, not to comfort anyone, to make the system visible. Because an invisible system cannot be understood, and a system that cannot be understood can only be endured, never known. The link is in the pinned comment. What Feynman knew about grief. Only available while this video is up. There is a chapter on the gut-sleep connection that covers exactly this. What the body is doing in the hours when grief makes rest impossible. There is another structure that deserves its own reckoning in any honest account of what happens in the night. The amygdala, the almond-shaped cluster of nuclei deep in the temporal lobe, the structure that processes emotional salience, that evaluates threat, that archives the emotional weight of experience, does not sleep the way the prefrontal cortex sleeps. During sleep, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, deliberate thought, rational evaluation, reduces its activity significantly. This is why we cannot reason our way through dreams. The inhibiting architecture has gone offline. The amygdala, by contrast, remains active during sleep, particularly during rapid eye movement sleep. When emotional memory consolidation occurs, the amygdala is processing, replaying, evaluating the emotional weight of what was stored during waking hours. In a grieving person, what the amygdala is processing at night is staggering. Every encounter with absence during the day, the empty chair, the name arriving in the inbox, the automatic reach for a phone that stops mid-gesture. Each is tagged with emotional salience and sent to be consolidated during sleep. The amygdala is returning to those moments, attempting to file them in a category that does not yet exist. The physiological cost of that nocturnal emotional labour is a measurable increase in amygdala activation, and through the pathways connecting the amygdala to the hypothalamus and the brainstem, an increase in autonomic arousal, in heart rate, in respiratory rate, and through the vagus nerve, in gut motility. The sleeping gut of a grieving person is not resting because the sleeping brain of a grieving person is not resting. They are coupled, not loosely, tightly, through the vagus nerve, through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, through the shared chemical language of cortisol and serotonin and inflammatory cytokines that crosses every organ boundary the body maintains. This is what most accounts of grief-related sleeplessness miss entirely. They describe the problem at the level of the mind, the intrusive thoughts, the hypervigilance, the inability to stop the mental replay. These descriptions are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They describe the surface of a phenomenon that goes all the way down to the gut wall, to the 500 million neurons that are also, in their own biochemical way, processing what has been lost. The body of a grieving person is not a mind struggling to sleep inside a body that would otherwise be fine. It is a coupled system, brain, gut, immune architecture, endocrine axis, all in a state of measurable biological disruption. And the disruption does not stop at 11 o'clock because the calendar says it is time for rest. There is a final piece of this that rarely appears in the literature on grief, perhaps because it requires holding two very different frames at once. The stomach, at its most basic biological function, is a muscle, a hollow, thick-walled, J-shaped muscle, lined with secretory cells and nerve plexuses, capable of extraordinary mechanical force. The grinding, churning, acid-bathed reduction of a meal into chyme is not a gentle process, but the stomach is also, in a way that has no clean analogy in physics, the site where humans across every culture have located something that cannot be fully explained by its anatomy. The gut feeling, the pit in the stomach, the visceral sense. Visceral, from the Latin viscera meaning the internal organs, of knowing something before you can say what you know. Feynman would have demanded a mechanism, and there is one. The enteric nervous system, through its constant afferent signalling to the brainstem and limbic structures, contributes to what neuroscientists call interoception, the brain's real-time representation of the body's internal state, not simply awareness of the body, part of the substrate of emotion itself. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent decades assembling the evidence for the somatic marker hypothesis, that emotional states are not purely cognitive events occurring in the brain, but are generated in part through the brain's reading of the body's current physical state. You do not simply think grief. You feel it in the stomach, in the chest, in the throat, in the specific heaviness behind the sternum that every person who has experienced significant loss recognizes immediately. And those physical signals are not the consequences of grief already processed by the mind, They are part of the mechanism by which grief becomes conscious in the first place. The stomach reporting its distress at 2 in the morning is not a side effect. It is part of how the organism comes to know what it has lost. The systems are not separable. The brain does not grieve while the body merely suffers the downstream consequences. They grieve together in their different biochemical languages, in the shared idiom of hormones and neurotransmitters and electrical impulses, and neither can go silent without changing what the experience is. There is no version of deep loss that leaves the gut untouched. There is no grief that stays above the collarbone. The ancient knowledge embedded in every language, the gut knowing, the physical intuition, the body's refusal to perform normalcy when something essential has been removed, was not metaphor. It was description. The 500 million neurons of the enteric nervous system are, in their own electrochemical way, part of the organism's reckoning with what it can no longer have, and the last thing your stomach should receive before bed, in the weeks and months of acute loss imkson tiyin, and is not a particular food or preparation designed to quiet the system. Before sleep, it is the recognition that what is happening inside it is not separate from what is happening in you. The stomach that wakes you at 2 in the morning, with its hollow and acid refusal to be silent, is not malfunctioning. It is, in the only language available to it, participating in the same reckoning that keeps the prefrontal cortex lit at 3 in the morning, and the amygdala filing its reports and the vagus nerve transmitting its signals in both directions, upward and downward, brain to gut and gut to brain. All through the night, because the organism has not yet finished understanding what has been lost. What Feynman knew about grief is in the pinned comment. The link is only there while this video is running. Every mechanism we have covered tonight, the vagus nerve, the cortisol curve, the serotonin pathway, the amygdala's nocturnal labour, it is all there and it goes further than this video can go. Feynman, near the end of his life, said that he thought nature was not cruel, that the complexity of things was not a punishment, but simply what complexity looks like from the inside. The body of a person in grief is complex in exactly that way. Not cruel, not malfunctioning, not failing some biological standard it should be meeting. Just doing, at 2 in the morning, with full biological sincerity, the only thing it knows how to do when something essential has been removed. It is trying to find a new stable state in a configuration it has never encountered before. And the stomach, at the centre of all of it, with the cortisol it cannot stop receiving, the serotonin it can no longer synthesize in the quantities it once made, the melatonin it cannot quite produce enough of, is not asking for anything. It is simply telling the truth about what the body already knows. And what the body already knows at 2 in the morning, in the weeks after a loss, is that the system has changed. The system has changed, and it is still, even now, even in the dark, even in the silence, doing what all living systems do when they are still alive and still working. It is trying to understand